Today, we are starting a new 3-week series that's titled Order, Disorder, Reorder. It's based on the writings of Franciscan friar, teacher, author Richard Rohr. And Richard noted that it seems quite clear that we grow by passing beyond some perfect order through an often painful and seemingly unnecessary disorder to an enlightened reorder or resurrection. It felt like those stages would fit well into these next 3 weeks of the Lenten season that we are currently in, and set us up very nicely for our Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday celebration services. And the more I read what Richard and some of his colleagues had to offer, I also saw how much of what they offered was calling upon, or at least inviting us to call upon, our divine power of wisdom, the power that we are highlighting in this month of March. And so I'm going to share a little bit about wisdom first, and then we'll move into the first topic of this series, which is order. Now, wisdom holds a very special place within the teachings of the 12 powers, which again is a teaching that was developed by our co-founder, Charles Fillmore, over 100 years ago. And it's special in that it is seen to be necessary to use as we develop the other 11 powers. Now, in her book, Your God-Given Potential, Unfolding the 12 Spiritual Powers, its author, Winifred Wilkinson Hausman, writes that wisdom is the highest form of spiritual knowing. And she notes that it includes divine judgment, discrimination, intuition, and other activities of mind that come under the heading of pure knowing. Wisdom is not dependent on reasoning, intellectual understanding, or deduction. It simply shines as the light from within that illumines the way and reveals what needs to be shown at a particular time. Now, Mr. Fillmore, he simply called wisdom the voice of God within. Relative to its relationship to our physical bodies, he placed it right in the pit of the stomach. And that's what we often reference when we try to explain a certain knowing that seems to defy logic or reasoning or standard ways of deduction. We just feel that truth in the pit of our stomach, and we know that it is right for us. The disciple associated with wisdom is James. Now, James was the brother of the disciple John, who represents the power of love, which we talked about last month. And the two of them, along with the disciple Peter, who is representative of the power of faith, which we will address next month, the three of them together were often present with Jesus during some of the most significant occasions in his life. He asked them to be present with him when he was raising a man's daughter from the dead. They were with him on the Mount of Transfiguration, where he was transformed and appeared to them in just his spiritual form. And he asked them to be with him so that they could wait and watch as he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. So the meaning here is that love, faith, and wisdom, they complement each other very well. They work together very well. They should be called upon, especially during the significant times and experiences of our lives. As it pertains to our series and today's first concept of order, what we want to remember is that while the ultimate expression of wisdom would be that clear, shining enlightenment, that enlightened knowing that we mentioned just a moment ago, while that's the ultimate expression, there are likely some, whether you want to call them steps to take or experiences to have before reaching that ultimate goal. Ms. Hausman writes, while the ultimate expression of the faculty is in the form of that clear, white inner light of knowing, its development begins in us as a process of re-education of our ability to know. Because we have chosen to clutter our thinking with false concepts, the world standards, and other limited forms of intellectual evaluation, we must re-educate our faculty of discrimination and judgment in order to awaken that spiritual light of knowing within us. And so one of the first things we can do to begin our re-education is to take a look at this concept of order. Now, order is one part of what Richard Rohr refers to as a universal pattern. It's a pattern that connects us and strengthens all of our relationships with everybody else and everything else around us. It is a pattern or a trajectory that's followed in our own processes of growth and transformation. And Richard pointed out a few of the philosophical and religious traditions and how they have used metaphors over centuries to chart this trajectory that he's referring to. We have Joseph Campbell and the 12 stages of the hero's journey. We have the 4 seasons or the 4 directions contained within many Native American religions. There is the account of the Exodus, the exile, and the promised land of the Jewish people, and the very present for us account right now of the cross, death, and resurrection within the story of Christianity. Now, all of these, and I'm sure so many more, they speak and want to move us towards love, towards oneness, towards salvation, if that is something that speaks to you, towards that enlightenment or transformation in some way. And Richard sees growth occurring as we move from order to disorder to reorder. So we begin with order. And it seems to be the easiest place to start, the easiest one to envision. And Richard says it is a needed first container. A needed first container. That's order. So what does order contain? Well, from a cultural perspective, it contains things like laws, traditions, customs, family loyalties, authorities, boundaries, some sense of morality. They are things that bring us a sense of security. They offer us a level of predictability. They can help us keep our impulses in check. And they also give us a sense of who we are, the ego, personality part of us. And this container needs to be strong because we all know that order isn't always lasting, right? I mean, challenges show up, chaos appears, contradictions to the very things we've placed in our container can show up. And when they do begin to show up, we could find ourselves with, a little bit of a struggle with that, rubbing up against some things, perhaps resisting some things. But times during which we find, ourselves maybe rejecting some of the original components that we placed in our container, or find ourselves deepening our convictions in what we've placed in our original container. And we're living in a time right now, and have for quite a while, I think, where a lot of questioning of long established elements of our containers is being exercised. People are questioning, and some are rejecting institutions, churches, authority figures, all of which have provided stability for a very, very long time. And it's looking to that perennial tradition that has held up over time to then help us create a positive, a powerful, a strong container for when the questions come. Richard writes, we are parts of social and family ecosystems that, when rightly structured, keep us from falling. More importantly, these systems show us how to fall and how to learn from that very falling. So what would be a few things to consider about the importance of the construct of our containers, such that they can both prevent us from falling and also help us learn and get back up when we do fall? Well, I'm just going to offer 3 of all that was offered from Richard and his colleagues. And the first of those is to consider necessary boundaries and laws. Now, boundaries, laws, along with tradition, that's what Richard calls order. And he sees these things as being very necessary in any spiritual system as well. First of all, he says they reveal our basic egocentricity, our self-interest. And second, he says they limit our basic egocentricity, our self-interests. And one way that came across to me, and I'm sure that can be interpreted in a number of different ways, but it spoke to me in saying that, parts of my container of order, serve to help me discover and know who I am in any given moment. And they also help me to grow further and to transform into more of all that I can still become. Now, when we think about boundaries, they help us to figure out where to stand, right? A place to begin, and possibly, morphing into a place from which we will move away from. But it is a place of solid ground. And it's one that we often embrace and use to great benefit and flourish with in our early years of life. Laws, well, they're given to us as a means of information, of education, and also, transformation. But the key word there is the word means. Laws are a means to an end, but they are not the end. In our conversation today, they are not the enlightenment, the growth, the transformation themselves. And there are those who would disagree with that. There are those who have a belief that adherence to certain laws, strict adherence to specific boundaries, those are the guarantors of enlightenment and salvation. But our message today is that they are all simply a part of the pattern of how transformation occurs. Now, rarely do boundaries remain the same as we go through our lives. And of course, laws are always being changed or created. And so, change in both areas is pretty much inevitable, I would think. So here's the picture that's being created. We form this strong container that gives us a sense of who we are. We build that foundation. We establish that cornerstone based on traditions, laws, morals, customs, and so forth. And then we can either stop right there and never ask any questions, never challenge anything, never advocate for change of any kind, as traditions and laws and customs and cultures change all around us. Or we can call upon the strength of that initial container that we have constructed to support us in asking those questions, in questioning ourselves, and doing so that we can discover more and respect our inherent power that we have, so that we can celebrate our individual and unique importance and place in this life and in this world, and have the element of freedom. That's how we grow. That's how we transform. And as Richard speaks of this is something that we should, and I believe we do, want for everyone. But he points out that we can't live in a place where everything is a matter of opinion, everything relative. So as we think about all that has come before us and can serve to create a strong container of order that supports us, Richard asks us to consider to having hope as its foundation, and a larger hope than just our own. He writes, there has to be a foundational hope, and for hope to be a shared experience, there must be agreed upon meanings, and shared stories that excite and inspire us all. He said, if there are truly stories from the great patterns that are always true, they will catapult us into a universal humanity. We will both stand on solid ground, and from that solid ground, create common ground. For the second item of consideration when thinking about the construct of your container of order, let me ask you a question. When I say the phrase, from innocence to knowledge, what well-known story comes to mind for you? And I'll give you a hint. It's one of those metaphorical stories from the Bible. From innocence to knowledge. If anybody thought of Adam and Eve, you win the prize this morning. Adam and Eve, the first human beings created by God, perfect, without sin, pure and innocent. And what did they do? they partook of the fruit from the tree of knowledge. The Garden of Eden is perhaps the ultimate example of order. All Adam and Eve had to do to not have to ever ask a question, never have a challenge, just stay in that idyllic place forever without a care in the world, was to not eat any fruit from that tree. They made a choice that kind of blew up paradise, basically evicted them from it, and made them responsible for their own lives. In a sense, seemingly had gone by the wayside. So, what have been your eviction from paradise stories? And when have you lost a sense of innocence that was once very much a part of how you defined yourself and how you lived your life? The earliest of mine that I can remember is growing up in my hometown of Pittsburgh. For decades, long time, Pittsburgh had been seen, and it was, a melting pot. People settling there coming from so many different countries, all different kinds of diverse ethnicities. But as I learned much later in my life, it was a segregated melting pot. And it's not that segregation was imposed on people by some outside force or laws. It was chosen by the various peoples themselves. My mother had shared with me, as it pertained to her parents' immigration from Europe, that they didn't know and therefore didn't understand all the others and all of the different ethnicities and backgrounds. The people all lived in fear of the other. And so as I grew up, in my container, everybody looked like me. My entire educational career from 1st through 12th grade, I never saw anyone in my classes that didn't look like me. Didn't see anybody in my neighborhood either, nor in my church, nor in an extended circle of friends. At my first job after graduating from high school, I had my very first experience of interacting with an African-American woman, the only African-American person in an office of about 50 or 60 people. Then when I was 23, I got married and I moved to Houston, Texas. And I was surrounded by people who didn't look like me. In many settings, there were very few who looked like me. My innocence was just blown away as I stepped into this brand new field of knowledge I had no idea existed. My life was no longer static and predictable. At first, a sense of security, safety felt a little bit uncertain. My foundation was a little bit shaken. There was so much new springing up all around me, so much for me to learn, so much for me to consider, to try to understand, so many questions to start asking myself about my way of life and beliefs as they had existed previously. And what I found the longer I was, in, this experience, was that it wasn't unsettling in a negative way. It was much more like a restlessness, not an anxiety, a restlessness to know more about other people. And I didn't know this back then, but in Richard's writings of recent time describes it pretty spot on for me when he writes, every estimate of others becomes a question of self-estimate. Every judgment upon life becomes a self-judgment. The question of the meaning of oneself becomes one with the meaning of life. And looking back, that move into this brand new city, that didn't destroy my original container of order. The truest and the lasting elements of it were there, and they were supporting me. What was taking place was just the beginning of a loss of innocence that was now time to replace with a much bigger, broader, wider one. It was also the beginning of uncovering the extent of my own lack of self-worth. And it was beginning that I came to understand as the years went on that would happen over and over and over again. Because as Richard points out, there's always some area of innocence in us that is untouched by knowledge. And there is always more knowledge to be had. The choice for knowledge in that biblical story is often referred to as the fall of man. Terrible thing that happened. But to me, today it feels like we're being invited to view that story as the exact opposite, that of being the growth and the transformation of humankind. The third construct of order, our order container, it kind of feels like a nice companion to what we just talked about. And Richard refers to it as awe, wonder, and love. He wrote about how these three things are very often in the foundations of religions and spiritual traditions. And there are times when we veer away from our very foundations and we begin to profess our beliefs instead in a certain specific listing of beliefs, of a particular creed of faith. Well, Valerie Cower is a Sikh activist and a human rights lawyer, and she believes that the religious instinct is actually much bigger and broader than that, than just one specific list of beliefs. And she points out how so many of those that we have come to call masters taught us to focus on the universal foundation. Buddha called for the practice of unending compassion. Abraham said to open our tent to everybody. Jesus taught us to love our neighbor. Muhammad to take in the orphan. All of them and more were calling for us to expand our definition of who is one of us, to seeing that there is an interconnectedness between and amongst all of us. Wonder, awe, and love, they have been a part of us since our lives began. Just think back to your childhood, that time of such innocence, such a sense of wonder. Laying down in the grass and just looking up, wondering, how did that tree towering above me get to be so big? Or what's really beyond what I can see in the sky? Can you really just reach up and touch a star? If we can reignite that wonder, that sense of awe, and apply it now, begin to wonder about the other people in our lives, their thoughts and their feelings, their stories, their sorrows, their joys, their needs, their wants. Begin to see them, see everyone as vast and as complex as we see ourselves. To begin to see them as an equal and not an other. It's a starting place to begin practicing the teachings of the masters, that of learning how to love another as we love ourselves. Order is our first naivete. That's what Richard Rohr posited at the end of his writings on this first piece of the universal pattern of life, growth, and transformation. And it's the reason we have 2 more weeks in the series. There's 2 more weeks because Richard believes that there is a further journey to travel, a further journey. It's our initial naivete about innocence and safety and having an explanation for everything and nothing ever changing that can build up the reluctance in us to let go of that first sense of innocence. But here's the thing, creating our initial container, creating that foundation, stability, identity, home life, relationships, community, security for our own life. That's what Richard calls the first task of our lives. That's the first half of our lives. If we stay there, that's when we avoid conflict. We avoid anything that's inconsistent. We avoid even pain. But all of those things are opportunities for growth. All of those things are opportunities for wonderful transformation. And many of us learn this avoidance because many of us were never told about this big world that's out there. And it was out there for us, for the taking, if we wanted to venture forth from the familiar and risk learning new things. many of us also come to a point where we find that things in that original container are no longer in full working order for us, and we're just not willing to settle anymore. We're not willing to just live only to survive. So instead of stopping here and being content with doing a survival dance, we're going to follow the lead of one of Richard's colleagues. His name is Bill Plotkin, and he put forth a suggestion that venturing out and doing a sacred dance is a much better and much more fulfilling choice. So we're going to do that next week. So be sure you bring your dancing shoes. God bless you.